What if I told you that the Philippines is fighting a war that has no bullets, no bombs, but has wounded an entire generation? A war where children are taught to hate the sound of their own mother's voice, where speaking your native tongue can destroy your future. Welcome to the language war that's tearing the Philippines apart. Picture this scene. A 6-year-old girl walks into her first day of school in Manila. At home, she speaks Tagalog with her grandmother, shares jokes in Bisaya with her cousins, and dreams in the language that shaped her earliest memory. But the moment she steps into that classroom, everything she knows becomes wrong. Her teacher speaks only English. The books are in English. Even her Filipino classmates whisper in English to sound smarter. Within weeks, this little girl starts to believe that her own language is inferior. She's not alone. This happens to millions of Filipino children every single day. But here's what nobody tells you. This isn't an accident. It's the result of a deliberate strategy that goes back over a century, designed to reshape the Filipino mind itself. And it's working. The year is 1901. American colonial administrators have just taken control of the Philippines from Spain. They are facing a massive problem. How do you control 7,000 islands with over 100 different languages and dialects? How do you govern people who can't even communicate with each other? The answer came from a man whose name you've probably never heard, but whose influence shaped every Filipino child's education for the next century. David Prescott Barrow, the first American director of education in the Philippines. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its impact. Instead of trying to suppress all local languages by force, he would do something much more sophisticated. He would make Filipinos voluntarily abandon their own tongues by convincing them that English was the key to success, prosperity, and modernity. But here's the shocking part. It wasn't just about language. It was about rewiring Filipino consciousness itself. Barrows understood something that modern psychologists have only recently proven. The language you think in doesn't just express your thoughts, it shapes them. Change someone's language, and you change how their brain processes reality. Within 5 years, American teachers were flooding into the Philippines. They came on a ship called the USS Thomas, and history remembers them as the Thomasites. But they weren't just teachers, they were cognitive engineers. Their mission: make Filipino children think like Americans. And this is where everything changes. The Thomasites didn't just teach English grammar and vocabulary. They taught Filipino children that everything associated with their local languages was primitive, backward, and shameful. Tagalog literature replaced with American poetry. Filipino folk tales swapped for Western fairy tales. Traditional songs passed down for generations, forgotten in favor of English hymns. Within a single generation, Filipino children started seeing their own culture through American eyes, and what they saw horrified them. But what nobody tells you is that this wasn't just happening in school. It was a complete cultural transformation. English became the language of commerce. If you wanted to get a job in the new colonial administration, you had to speak perfect English. If you wanted to trade with American businesses, English was mandatory. If you wanted your children to have any hope of success, they needed to master English. Local languages became associated with poverty, ignorance, and failure. Parents who had grown up speaking Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, or any of dozens of other Filipino languages began forcing their children to speak only English at home. They believed they were giving their kids a better future. What they were actually doing was severing connections to thousands of years of Filipino wisdom, creativity, and identity. But here's where the story takes a tragic turn. By the 1920s, the Philippines had become the most English-proficient non-native English-speaking country in the world. American colonial officials celebrated this as proof of Filipino intelligence and adaptability. What they didn't mention was the cost. An entire generation of Filipinos was growing up unable to communicate with their own grandparents. Traditional knowledge that had been passed down orally for centuries was disappearing. Ancient concepts that existed only in Filipino languages had no English equivalents and were simply being lost forever. The Philippines was becoming culturally orphaned, and then something unexpected happened that changed everything. World War II. When Japanese forces invaded the Philippines in 1941, they brought their own language policy. Japanese became the mandatory language of education and administration. English was banned. Anyone caught speaking English could be imprisoned or executed. Suddenly, Filipinos were forced to rediscover their own languages as tools of resistance. In the mountains of Luzon, guerrilla fighters communicated in Ilocano that Japanese occupiers couldn't understand. In the jungles of Mindanao, resistance networks operated in Cebuano and other local dialects. Filipino languages became codes that helped drive out foreign invaders. For the first time in decades, speaking Filipino wasn't a sign of backwardness. It was an act of patriotism. But here's what nobody tells you about what happened next. When American forces returned and the Philippines gained independence in 1946, the new Filipino government faced a choice that would define the nation's future. They could build a truly Filipino educational system based on local languages and culture, or they could return to the American model that had already proven so successful at producing English-speaking graduates. They chose English. Why? Because by 1946, an entire generation of Filipino leaders had been educated to believe that English proficiency was synonymous with intelligence, sophistication, and global competitiveness. They genuinely believed they were making the best choice for their new nation. They were wrong. And this is where the real tragedy begins. In 1973, President Ferdinand Marcos made a shocking announcement. Filipino would become the national language of the Philippines, and Tagalog would be its foundation. English would remain important, but Filipino would be the primary language of instruction in school. This should have been a moment of cultural renaissance. Instead, it triggered a civil war fought with words instead of weapons. Regional groups erupted in fury. Why should their children learn Tagalog when they spoke Cebuano, Ilocano, Waray, or dozens of other languages? Why was Manila imposing its dialect on the entire archipelago? English suddenly became the neutral choice. It didn't favor any particular Filipino region or ethnic group. It was the language of unity in a divided nation. But here's the shocking part that changed everything. The debate was never really about English versus Filipino languages. It was about which version of Filipino identity would survive. Would the Philippines become a nation that celebrated its linguistic diversity, with English as a unifying tool for international communication? Or would it become a nation that abandoned its linguistic heritage entirely in favor of global integration? The answer came in the form of a single, devastating policy change. In the 1990s, the Philippine government quietly shifted back to English as the primary medium of instruction in schools. The reason given was economic competitiveness. English-speaking Filipinos could work in call centers, become overseas foreign workers, attract international businesses. Filipino languages were once again relegated to second-class status. And that's when the real damage became visible. What nobody tells you is what this language war has done to Filipino families. Today, millions of Filipino children grow up speaking better English than their native tongues. They can discuss complex scientific concepts in English but can't explain their feelings to their grandparents in the family's ancestral language. Parents brag about their children's English proficiency while secretly mourning the fact that their kids can't fully understand the lullabies that had been sung in their families for generations. Grandparents die taking with them stories, jokes, and wisdom that can't be translated into English because their grandchildren never learned the languages needed to receive this inheritance. But here's where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. This language war has created a generation of Filipinos who are fluent in a foreign language but strangers to their own culture. They can write perfect English essays about Shakespeare but can't understand the literary genius of Francisco Balagtas. They can sing American pop songs flawlessly but have never heard the epic poetry of the Durangers. They've become culturally homeless in their own country, and the psychological damage runs deeper than anyone realized. Recent studies have revealed something shocking. Filipino children who grow up primarily speaking English show higher rates of depression, anxiety, and identity confusion than those who maintain strong connections to their native languages. Why? Because language isn't just communication. It's the foundation of identity, the bridge to ancestral wisdom, the key to understanding who you are and where you come from. When you lose your language, you lose a piece of your soul. But here's what really shows how devastating this language war has become. Walk into any middle-class Filipino home today, and you'll witness something that would have been unimaginable a century ago. Parents speaking to their children in English, children responding in English, entire families conducting their most intimate conversations in a language that none of their ancestors spoke. They are not doing this to show off or to exclude anyone. They are doing it because they genuinely believe it's the best thing for their children's future. They've been convinced that loving your children means teaching them to reject their own cultural inheritance. And this brings us to the most shocking revelation of all. The Philippines has become the world's most successful example of voluntary cultural suicide. No foreign power forced Filipinos to abandon their languages. No dictator banned local dialects. No military occupation imposed linguistic uniformity. Filipinos chose this. They embraced it. They fought for the right to raise their children in a foreign tongue, because they were taught that this was the price of progress. But what if they were wrong? What if the choice between English proficiency and Filipino linguistic heritage was a false choice created by people who benefited from Filipino cultural confusion? And this is where everything changes. Something remarkable is happening among young Filipinos today. A new generation is refusing to accept that they must choose between global competitiveness and cultural authenticity. They are learning English for international opportunities while simultaneously rediscovering their ancestral languages. They are creating art that blends Filipino and Western tradition. They are proving that you can be globally competitive without becoming culturally rootless. But here's what nobody tells you about this cultural renaissance. It's happening despite the educational system, not because of it. These young Filipinos are teaching themselves what schools refuse to teach them. They are learning Filipino languages from YouTube videos, social media groups, and conversations with elderly relatives. They are healing wounds that official policies created, and they are discovering something that the architects of the language war never wanted them to know. Filipino languages aren't barriers to success. They are advantages. Cognitive scientists have proven that multilingual brains are more creative, more flexible, and better at problem solving than monolingual ones. Children who grow up truly bilingual, not just English proficient, show superior performance in mathematics, logic, and abstract thinking. The Philippines could have produced generations of globally competitive citizens who were also deeply rooted in their own cultures. Instead, language policies created generations of cultural orphans who are fluent in English but strangers to themselves. But here's the most shocking part of this entire story. The language war isn't over. It's still raging in every Filipino classroom, every Filipino family, every Filipino heart. Right now, as you're listening to this, millions of Filipino children are being taught that the languages their parents speak at home are inferior to English. Millions of Filipino parents are struggling with the heartbreaking choice between their children's cultural heritage and their economic future. Millions of Filipinos are living with the psychological wounds of growing up believing that their own voices were somehow wrong. And here's what makes this tragedy even more devastating. Other countries have figured out how to be globally competitive while maintaining their linguistic diversity. Singapore uses 4 official languages. Switzerland operates in German, French, Italian, and Romansh. Canada thrives with English and French. But the Philippines was convinced that it had to choose between English and everything else. That choice was never necessary. It was imposed by people who understood that a people disconnected from their cultural roots are easier to control, easier to exploit, and less likely to question authority. The language war was never about education or economic development. It was about power, and it worked exactly as intended. But here's the message that should give every Filipino hope. It's not too late to end this war. Languages can be revived. Cultures can be reclaimed. Connections to ancestral wisdom can be restored. All it takes is the recognition that being Filipino doesn't mean choosing between global competitiveness and cultural authenticity. It means embracing both. It means raising children who can negotiate international business deals in perfect English and then come home to share stories with their grandparents in the languages that shaped their families for generations. It means creating educational systems that see multilingualism as a strength, not a problem to be solved. It means understanding that the Philippines' greatest asset isn't its English proficiency. It's its incredible linguistic and cultural diversity, a diversity that represents thousands of years of human creativity, wisdom, and adaptation. A diversity that's been under attack for over a century but has never been completely destroyed. A diversity that could make the Philippines the most culturally rich and globally competitive nation in Southeast Asia. If Filipinos choose to end the language war and embrace their full heritage, the choice is theirs. And the time is now, because every day that passes, more Filipino children lose the ability to hear the voices of their ancestors. Every day that passes, more Filipino families are divided by languages they can't share. Every day that passes, the Philippines becomes more fluent in a foreign tongue and more silent in its own voice. The language war has already claimed too many casualties. The question isn't whether it will end. The question is whether it will end with the victory of cultural authenticity or cultural amnesia. Whether Filipino children will grow up proud of their full heritage or ashamed of everything that makes them uniquely Filipino. Whether the Philippines will become a nation of people who happen to live in the same archipelago or a nation of people united by shared languages, cultures, and story. The weapons in this war aren't guns or bombs. They are words, policies, and choices made every day by parents, teachers, and leaders who may not even realize they are fighting. But the stakes couldn't be higher, because what's at risk isn't just language, it's the soul of a nation. And once that's lost, it can never be fully recovered. The language war that divided the Philippines is still being fought. But it's not too late to choose a different ending. An ending where Filipino children grow up fluent in the languages of both their ancestors and the world. Where being globally competitive and culturally rooted aren't contradictory goals. Where the Philippines becomes living proof that a nation can embrace its full heritage while reaching for its highest dreams. The war can end, but only if Filipinos decide to stop fighting themselves and start fighting for themselves. The choice is in their hands, and the future of Filipino identity hangs in